Hello, and welcome to this, the Savage Balance Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode number 28 of the Savage Balance Podcast. How you all doing, guys? I hope you've had a good week and you've been safe and socially distanced and working in accordance with those governmental rules to help us ease our way out of lockdown in the UK. Thank you very much to everyone who listened to last week's episode. If you missed it, it was sort of about, well, it was about Nikki Graham and, the tragic loss of her life to the complications and battle with anorexia. But it wasn't so much about her life. It was more around the concept of blame, really. Like, there's a lot of blame going on and people pointing specific direct fingers and going, that's at fault, that's at fault, that's at fault. And so I wanted to take a deeper dive into those sort of aspects that people are blaming and try and broaden them out a bit and find the nuance within them and talk about them in a bit more depth. So that sort of goes on to a bit about Big Brother and then that way of making programming, reality television, the concept of fame, a bit about the NHS and the lockdown and anorexia itself. It's a podcast that I was proud of, really. That's what I'm saying. I was proud of it. And, if you missed it, I would recommend going and checking it out because it was, I think tackled those subjects well and I think it's worth spreading. So do that. Do that, please. Cheers. I didn't know how to finish that. Just a blunt kind of, next thing on the list. That bit weird. Anyway, I'm going to do a kind of, I'd say, trigger warning of sorts about this episode, just because there's some, I'd say, a very infrequent use of homophobic and misogynistic language that some people may not like. Like, it's all within context and it's there for a reason, but I could imagine people, hearing that word in their past or hearing it in the present, but still living with the effects of it in the present. And, it's just worth knowing about these things. So there's a little kind of warning of sorts for you. It's not like, I sort of imagine trigger warnings like coming along like with big horns and big hooters like, "Auga, warning, auga, warning." But that was just a sort of kind of, some words if you want to, I don't know if you want it, maybe kind of, I'm not sure. It's not very like strong, I feel it's almost like a doubtful trigger warning. Like, I'm not sure, is this a trigger warning? I don't know. But it's there anyway, in case any of you get upset about that stuff, it's coming now. So anyway, you'll know what this podcast is about. That's why you've clicked on it and started listening. I sort of want to discuss the idea and the concept of the phrase man up, really. Try to look at it with a bit of nuance, investigate the sort of potential negatives, the potential positives, try to come to some conclusions, but just sort of have a fish around in there and see what's going on within that phrase. I think it's a phrase that many people are familiar with. It's something I certainly heard a lot when growing up in Dartford, and I think it's used quite a lot, really, predominantly in working class areas. And primarily I'd heard it amongst men, but usually older men than me. Like, it was usually, in fact, I'd say for me personally, almost always, it was either people, of my age or older, really. Or like, even if they were of my age, there was a sense that they were sort of above me, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't know, more tough or more self-assured or self-confident. They'd say, man up in sort of ways like that. And like, I wanted to get a good definition of it because I thought it was quite a hard thing to define. And actually looking online, there are, I'd say, tons of different definitions, but they're all kind of slight variants of others. So I think it showcases that there is a kind of broad sense in which this phrase is used. Like, it covers quite a lot of things and people can use it for quite a lot of different situations. But one of the best definitions I saw, and I'm quoting now, I'm reading this out. To be a man about it, to do the things a good man is traditionally expected to do, such as taking responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, displaying bravery or toughness in the face of adversity, providing for one's family, etc. There's also a few other definitions like demonstrating toughness or courage when faced with a difficult situation, to step up to his responsibilities, to be strong, or to show less emotion. I think in general, it's sort of like basically stepping up to the plate. Like now, like whatever's going on, whatever difficulties you're feeling, now's the time to step up to the plate. Be a man about it. Come on, man up. You've got to be there to fulfill your duties and your roles. I think that's sort of it. To grow a pair. In fact, it works in conjunction with those sorts of phrases, to grow a pair, to grow a pair of basically like male, masculine, testicular bollocks is what they're saying. Grow a pair of hairy bollocks no, actually it wouldn't be hairless bollocks, would it? It would be bushy bollocks. Grow a pair of bushy bollocks. But there's other phrases like pull yourself together and stiff upper lip actually is interesting because I think the other ones you could say they're kind of new even though they've been around for a few decades, I imagine, maybe older than that. But stiff upper lip has, deeper generational ties. It goes back to that sort of war mentality. So even though I feel like they're very similar phrases and mean kind of quite similar things, it's born from, it's more prevalent amongst a different generation, an older generation. So they sort of work in conjunction with each other there. I think for many, it's part of their daily use of language, really, isn't it? It's kind of a good colloquial term that isn't specific to an area, like it's specific to a whole country. It's not like regional. I think it's quite commonly used. In fact, you know what? I might be wrong about that. I don't know. Maybe it's not said so much about up north, but I think I've heard it from different places before, so that might be wrong. But I think in general, like it's used quite a bit, specifically by men. I'd say between sort of 20s to maybe even 50s or 60s, that sort of high up. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is I think because it's in people's daily use of language, I think many people wouldn't have questioned if there was any potential damage that the phrase could do and what maybe is meant by it or some of the subtler messages that are hidden within it. So I just wanted to explore around those, really. So let's start exploring, shall we? How can the phrase man up be damaging? Well, I think, first of all, it's kind of maybe obvious, but worth saying that it's a phrase used at and by men almost exclusively. I reckon a fair few women say it as well, and maybe it's even said to a few women, but I think on the whole it's exclusively said at men. It's in the phrase, isn't it? It's man up. It's said at men, essentially. And when you look at those definitions I talked about earlier, taking responsibility for your actions, displaying bravery, strength in the face of adversity, providing for your family, there's nothing inherently wrong with those desires and impulses. In fact, they're really good impulses to have. They're like amazingly strong impulses to have. But I think one of the initial problems for me starts when you're sort of expecting men to understand how to do those things naturally, as if the phrase man up just means you'll kickstart some kind of inherent, as if it was built into our DNA. And I reckon there's a good chance it could be built into our DNA and like in our ancestry, because, we had to be cooperative to survive, and things like strength in the face of adversity and taking responsibility for your actions, these are kind of good things to have in a group dynamic, really. So if you wanted to survive in the group, it wasn't a case of being selfish. You had to be cooperative and providing for your family, as in providing for your tribe. There's a good cause that they could be built in our DNA, like they're built in our genes. But I reckon as well, like whether that is true or not, that these aren't necessarily essential, natural, human being traits. I think these are taught traits. You have to be taught them. And I think the examples of those would be people who haven't been taught them. And then you see that they can't instinctively, naturally find them. They're not just there. They have to, they would have to either relearn them or they go their lives without them. So I think it's unrealistic and kind of idealized to just assume that men would know these sorts of actions, really. And when it's sort of said, like, it sort of encompasses that, but when it's sort of said, it feels like there's, to me, like almost like a kind of military vibe to it. Like some might argue, in fact, some might argue that there's a good call for sort of, military type language, specifically in the military, saying like young people need that discipline and it can help them when they're feeling a bit lost and it can give them a career and all of these sorts of things. Like the military is not something I'm wholeheartedly, I'd say, in favor of. It might be another podcast to do one day because it's difficult and it's nuanced, and like my idealized view of the world sometimes comes up against the practical side. So me, as a pacifist, for example, struggles with the idea of sort of military. But I'm basically saying, from my perspective at least, there's a good discussion to be had and lots of different voices to be heard. And I don't know those voices and I don't know what they're saying, but in general, I think something I can say with confidence is that that sort of military-esque approach shouldn't be used for all men, because there is a huge spectrum of men. Men, basically you'll probably see every type or personality type of humanity within men, and one style or one type of talking to them, an aggressive undertone and sort of barking orders at someone, that's what it feels like man up, like just fucking man up, son, fucking man up, boy, come on. Like that feels like an order, and I don't think that it like encompasses the full spectrum of men. So when you are trying to effectively force that kind of military-esque type of teaching or learning on people, I think you're effectively creating an environment of and encouraging a culture of toxic masculinity. Now, I do just want to take a moment to define toxic masculinity, because I think there are plenty of people out there who believe that that phrase is really just an attack on masculinity itself, on manness, in an era where they feel like, feminism and toxic masculinity are just trying to attack me as a man, like my natural instincts and impulses. And, like that's not fair. And so some people might feel under attack by that. And so I want to say really that toxic masculinity isn't specifically about masculinity itself. It's not just saying all masculinity is toxic masculinity. I found a good definition, actually, which I'll read to you now. Toxic masculinity refers to traditional cultural masculine norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. Rather than condemning men or male attributes, it emphasizes the harmful effects of conformity to certain traditional masculine ideal behaviors, such as dominance, self-reliance, and competition. So it's not really in that sentence, like it's clear that it's not masculinity or the idea of maleness as a whole. It is the more harmful effects of it, of conforming to certain traditional masculine ideal behaviors. Like it's a specific brand or a specific breed of masculinity. And like there's plenty of I'd say masculinity encompasses a lot of a lot of traits, you might say, that they're not exclusively male, they're female as well, but people tend to put them in the box of masculinity. Things like assertiveness, industriousness, strength, courage, independence, violence, aggressiveness and protectiveness, competitiveness, sexual appetite, passion, confidence. These are all sort of masculine traits, and in themselves aren't inherently bad. Like having a sexual appetite isn't inherently in itself bad. Like courage is a good quality to have, really. Like you might need that courage, to use with, for example, aggressiveness and protectiveness if, for example, your loved ones or your family are in danger and you need that skill to protect them from this danger. I think that's a good use of those things, but I think the toxic masculinity refers to things becoming harmful when they're kind of amplified and then they're set in stone. So like they're heightened, but then they're rigid and they can't be moved. This is like, it's like yes or no. There's no degrees, there's no spectrum. It's like, this is what it takes to be a man. So for example, like aggressiveness, protecting your family, you'd say, that's a good reason to have that aggressiveness within you. But if you're trying to get that promotion and you're sort of ruining people's lives in an attempt to get it, that's toxic, really. That's a toxic environment to be in. Violence as well. I just mentioned, the army before, and it's complicated, but it is true that there are times when violence is unavoidable. Like it might be brought to you, and then you might have to use certain, strength and courage and violence to protect yourself. And it's hard to argue against that. But, if you're out at the pub at night and you're pissed and you're looking for somebody to pick a fight with, to prove something to somebody else, that's harmful. That's toxic to yourself, to the people around you, to society in general. So I think when telling someone to man up, I think you're highlighting those more toxic elements of it. For example, if someone's saying, I'm working too many hours and I want to see my partner and my kids. If you're telling them, man up, just suck it up and just get on with it, you're encouraging and breeding that sort of toxic element and not listening to the person who's, saying that difficulty. I just think in general, it provides a kind of rigidity to masculinity. It's too rigid, it's too solid. Men have to be this, and we have to push all men, all specifically male-born people, or like we have to push them through this mold. And this provides a definition of what it is to be a man. Like if masculinity is rigid and like this is what it is, then that provides a specific definition of what it is to be a man. And if we have that, then the language itself defines the gender or the difference between the two genders. For example, like saying those things, it's telling you a certain way to be a man. And in contrast, I guess it's also telling you what it is to be a woman. But a YouGov report from 2019 showed that 61% of Britain's young men feel pressured to man up as a result of damaging gender stereotypes. So the phrase itself implies that, only doing these things will make you manly. Like responsibility and strength, or I say strength, more like showing no weakness, both physically and emotionally, being tough, being the breadwinner. The idea that these are gender-specific things isn't true. And the fact that, as I said, 61% of young men feel pressure to man up as a result of damaging gender stereotypes, you can see why that would be so damaging. And in fact, another reason to talk about this, why it's so important, is the fact that unfortunately, like male suicide is just like such a high thing. And I've heard this stat said so many different ways, so I don't know the specific ages, but I've heard it as young as 16 and as high as about 45. But somewhere between that age bracket, suicide is the highest killer amongst men, which is just a staggering fact, isn't it? It's just staggering that many people. The idea of suicide being a leading cause of any group is horrific. But when you hear it, it's like quite a predominant group and such a broad group as well. Just men of that age, men of, 16 up to 45. You think that's so many people. I'm not sure if it's specifically in the UK, that fact actually, but I just think, gender, like having a rigid idea of gender really helps emphasize what people feel like the pressure to feel like what a man, what you should, the pressure that there is to be a man can cause those sorts of things. And, if we go back to the list, for example, like, strength, the idea that strength is a masculine trait in general, and using that, through man up, like, pick up that box, man up. Like the pressure there is not just physically on your body if you can't manage it, but also emotionally, like I have to do that. And then potential shame that you might feel afterwards. Like this is a very, like you can see the damage. Like as we start to unpick this, you can see how clearly the damage can also be there. And I just also think, by associating those attributes to one sex specifically, you are by its very nature claiming the exact opposite attributes to the other sex. So by assuming these traits, assertiveness, aggressiveness, competitiveness, passion, confidence, assuming that these are male traits means that the opposite of those things are female traits. So females then can't be competitive. Females can't be passionate and confident. They can't be assertive. So that's another topic really that Man Up is. It has an inherent kind of sexist view of women, really. Sexist view. Like it really does perpetuate misogyny and sort of assumes inferiority to women, as if women, are there to be looked after, in the example of breadwinner. So that example I said earlier, the person saying, I'm working too many hours and I want to see my wife and kids more. They might be doing that because they feel the need to be the sole breadwinner. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe that doesn't have to be the way things are. Maybe, maybe that person's partner, assuming they're a wife in this scenario, maybe they want to work. Maybe they're willing to work. Maybe they're not willing to work, but maybe they've been taught that they shouldn't be willing to work, that they should be, just there to the man goes out as a breadwinner to do that. So when that man is then told, man up, suck it up, work more hours, just fucking do it, son. You can see how damaging it is and how that's going to cause a strain on that. And also that's going to change that person's perspective of his female partner, really. Like, I'm doing all this work for you. I think that's a lot of arguments, especially that you see on telly, like women saying, you're not paying me enough attention. And the husband saying, you know how much work I do for you. And I think that's a reflection a bit of real life and what people experience. So and you can understand it almost in a sense from both people's point of view, but it's built on this kind of sexist mentality that, the woman is there to be looked after and the man is there to work. And that's just one of like tens and tens of, or maybe potentially even 100 sort of different hidden traits within masculinity and within man up. And it's not just in phrases like man up, actually, the kind of misogyny. Like there's the opposite phrases as well. There's phrases like, and this was one of the phrases I was saying about the trigger warning, pussy, or not ladylike. Like calling somebody a pussy is basically saying you're weak and you're afraid because, I'm comparing you to female genitalia. And it's been written about so many times before, but you just think that to me is not a place of weakness. That is a place of childbirth. That is a place of, for at least for most women, not all women, monthly bleeding and, hormonal mood swings and stuff. Like it's difficult. I didn't know what to say then. I wouldn't say it's hard. It's really hard, isn't it? And then, I have to glance down and go, there's not a vagina on me, is there? I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I'm sure they're great as well. Thumbs up to them. But moving on, I don't want to talk about that anymore. Not ladylike, if someone's being called not ladylike, it's like an assumed set of values as to what being a lady is. Lady is a bit of a patronising word a lot of the time anyway. Maybe that's just me and my experience, but I don't often hear lady without it sounding really patronising. Something I was talking about with my partner actually today on our pooch walk, and I think she brought it up, and it's something I agree with for sure. Like the sexist thing, like in regards to man up as well, like you see it in a lot of advertising as well. Like if you type in man up advert, there's so many like adverts of people like eating burgers or drinking beers. There's a specific Burger King advert which I kind of was toying between whether I should play some or not, but then I didn't know whether I'd get in trouble. Like, I don't know if any lawyers would come after me and say, like, you've taken a bit of a Burger King advert, you've got to pay some money or take it down. Or so I decided against playing that, but, like, it's a specific advert where they're singing a song about, eating burgers. And, like, as a display of masculinity, at one point, somebody pulls up in a car and a bunch of men are cheering while he's holding up one of the burgers. And in their rage, they do, what every group of men would do, which is throw a car off the end of a bridge. So that's definitely worth checking out. In fact, talking about man up and adverts, a lot of those are like related to food and drink, and especially actually like burgers and meat. They're like classed as a masculine thing. So I think it's worth pointing out Carol J. Adams' work here. If you're interested, she does a lot of work on feminism and veganism and the links between those two, and how we see, like how women are often degraded in adverts, and they are compared to the meat, and the meat is sort of like a something that has been killed and slaughtered and prepared for men, and it's almost like both the women and the meat are there for men's consumption. That is sort of like the underpinning thing that is there in a lot of adverts, and she says lots of wonderful things, but do check out Carol J. Adams' work. It's really interesting. But I don't think it's like, we talked about gender, we talked about sex, but it's not just the specific differences between men and women. I do just want to take a brief moment here to say, I wanted to mention more things to do with non-binary and to do with agender and bigender and all the different kinds of reflections of gender within it. But with a phrase like man up, I think like it would have been a whole different podcast. There's a lot to say when reflecting the other gender identities as well. So, but I didn't want it to go unmentioned because I know I'm talking about men and women and not women. Men. I'm talking about men and women a lot. But, I don't necessarily subscribe to just the idea of men and women. Like, I think there's a lot to be said about non-binary and agender and bigender and all the trans aspects of it as well. So, but I think it goes beyond sex and gender. Like there's a lot of, homophobia wrapped up in a phrase like man up. Like man up is a phrase that is used, I think, a lot to stamp out softness. Are you being fucking soft, son? Come on, man up. And softness is a common word associated with homosexuality. So by telling someone to man up because of homosexual tendencies, you are inherently implying that homosexual people aren't real men. And when I said that stat before, that 61% of young men feel pressure to man up as a result of damaging gender stereotypes. Like, if you think it's that high for gender stereotypes, imagine people who grow up thinking and feeling they're gay, like they're attracted to the same gender. And yet phrases like man up are there to stamp out softness. And I think, like ideas around kind of like unhelpful stereotypes and like divisive stereotypes really, like a kind of sort of limp-wristed, camp-voiced, very soft, kind of hyper-feminine. A lot of people have that idea that is homosexuality, which isn't true. Although it is worth saying that these traits are what some people have and what some people experience. But to make them feel inferior because, of they're having to live up to expectations about what it should be to, be a man, to man up, to be masculine, like is another example of that harmful, toxic masculinity as well. And you can see why that could cause all sorts of lasting psychological wounds on people. Like, it's really serious sort of things. Like, I think man up sort of goes a lot as well with like, and here's one of the other words I was going to say about the trigger warning, words like puff, like that's for a lot of people like deeply scarring, and like that sort of language can go hand in hand with man up. Like, don't be soft, don't be a puff, come on, man up. Like, they exist very strongly together, and like the idea that people are having to, suppress and not completely live in and exhibit sort of whatever tendencies they have, or even if they don't have it as part of their identity, just to be able to have it open within them and not have it, crushed by the language that they've been exposed to. Language like telling somebody to man up because maybe when they were a child they wanted to run around, or they wanted to wear a dress, or they wanted to, like, maybe not run around, but you know what I mean, like run around silly, or play with the girls, or play with Barbies, or, all of these things that naturally, like, people who might say man up feel a bit uncomfortable about and think, oh, I think my son might be soft, I think they might be queer, I think they might be gay, I think they might be a puff. All of these unfortunate and sort of kind of horrific uses of language. You can see why they can cause all these psychological wounds on people. Other examples of why the phrase man up can be damaging is, I think it can like create this masculine hierarchy. Like, for example, I think man up is not often said to people as equals. I think it's said from somebody who feels a bit dominant over somebody else. So it can be to do with age, it can be to do with status, like through jobs and stuff, or it can be, a threat of violence or a threat of like physicalness. But even in some way, I think it's often said, on par to somebody or down. Like I think I've got kind of feminine attributes to me. Like, I'm born a man and I identify as male per se. Like, it's tricky, and I'm not 100% sure and confident about that in myself, but I'm okay with that at the moment anyway. But I think I've got a lot of, so-called feminine attributes within me, and it would feel strange to me to go up to somebody who was kind of like on that toxic masculine spectrum and to tell them to man up. Not just because it's not a phrase I would use, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. It would be their job to say it sort of down. I think it creates a kind of toughness and toxic masculine hierarchy, and maybe like said on par as well to some people. Like, if I have to do this, so do you. Like, if we're equals, if I'm working, that example with the working hours earlier, if I'm working this many hours and I'm putting up with it, you have to work this many hours and you have to put up with it. Like, we're on the same page. So you've got to man up like I have to man up and do it. And yet somebody like higher up on that aggressive spectrum might tell them, to man up, maybe do more hours. Do you know what I mean? I think it creates a kind of physically charged, and also like, no, it's not just physical, is it? There's like a kind of almost like mind games, kind of like there's a mental toughness as well as a physical toughness kind of hierarchy within it, which I think is damaging. Like, it's damaging to get your orders from somebody from a place of like aggressiveness rather than, respect, for example. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, some of the stats I mentioned earlier and stuff to do with suicide, like, there's such a big, huge push for men's mental health recently. And I think man up is one of the phrases that is sort of really acutely targeted by people like the Good Men Project and stuff like that. I think one of the reasons it's there is because, like a phrase like man up can be said, and because it's said in that kind of hierarchical sense, it's said sort of demeaning. You're saying it down to somebody. So it's like a put down. Like, it's like sometimes it doesn't feel like, maybe it's meant to build somebody up, but sometimes I think it's not meant to build somebody up. It's like meant aggressively. And that sort of environment can encourage lots of shame. And then, shame can go off in all sorts of depression, like depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and, potential, attempting to commit suicide. And it also, you have to then repress your emotions and hold on to your emotions and not express them. So I think, a phrase like that is not giving the education that, men need into having a healthy relationship with their emotions. I've read it before online and I liked the quote, we don't need men to be less emotional, but perhaps we do need them to communicate more effectively about their emotions with an emphasis on emotions other than anger. Like sometimes that is a common trait amongst men, isn't it? Especially in that kind of masculine hierarchical thing I mentioned before. Like anger is a big driver of this phrase, and anger is a big driver of who you would say it to. Like it's not meant, if you wouldn't hear it like, oh, it's okay, like everything will be okay. If you can just find it within you to man up, then you'll get there. Like it's often said down, isn't that put down way, isn't it? With that kind of anger tone to it. Like just fucking grow a pair and man up. Just pull your shit together and do it. So I think obviously that has a huge impact on men's mental health. I think as well, like mentioned, that's sort of a colloquial term, but like I think cultural norms has a big part to play, because I think many people might hear that phrase and think, it's just language. Like we know what's meant by it. It's just something that's said, and we know, it just means pull yourself together a bit. So I think people would say like it's harmless use of language. But that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this as well, is I think it's very easy to be indoctrinated into a way of thinking. And I don't mean that like accusatory, as in those people have been indoctrinated into a way of thinking. We all are, and we all have to be, really. That's part of learning. We're indoctrinated into what it means to grow up, in certain countries and time periods and socioeconomic statuses and families, education systems, cultural identities. Like these are all things that help mold us, friends, any trauma and stuff like that we're exposed to. These are all things that help mold us, and gender identity plays a huge part in that. And a lot of that is perpetuated culturally, a lot of gender identity. In fact, potentially all. I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? It's hard to say how much of it is and isn't, but a lot of gender identity is passed through culturally. So when somebody says it's harmless, it usually means that they're not the recipient of the painful aspects of that way of thinking and that way of talking about things. So I think that's worth pointing out. Like if you're someone who thinks this is maybe a harmless piece of language, try to think about, who's used that language around you, where you've heard it before, what you think about those people. Like, are they people you respect? Are they people you admire for different reasons in other ways? Like, it's worth analyzing it in that way to see where it comes from. And then maybe that might be the beginning of opening you up to seeing the potential harm that I've been talking about for all this time, really. But, having said all of that, like, this is a bit I thought maybe, I might lose some people who are like, all right, on board and go, yeah, man up's a problem. I think it is. Like, I think I've made a good case for why I think the phrase man up is a problematic phrase. And I think it's a phrase that maybe we should ditch. I do also think, however, that maybe it's not as like easy as that maybe it's a bit more complicated. And I think that there is also some merit to, a phrase like man up, or at least intended merit. For example, like I've said it within those other phrases as well, grow a pair, pull yourself together, stiff upper lip. Like it's missing the mark. And it's not addressing the problem. But I think what it is trying to do, it is trying to create some kind of change within someone. Like it's an attempt, at least, to try and encourage someone back from potentially a depressed or anxious state or a self-pitying state. Like, and it can be hard to know sometimes how to communicate. And especially if you've got this kind of inbuilt phrase that you've just learned and picked up. like it can be hard sometimes, I imagine, to not use it. And I can imagine a lot of people would intend it to mean, like, I see you in a lot of pain. I don't want you to be in pain. So if you can just like pull yourself up, by the bootstraps and be ready for the day, then like you'll get through this. I think a lot of the time, maybe not a lot of the time, but certainly there are examples when people are using it from that place. I think it's also like in that same vein, it's people wanting to show, like they want to see somebody to show some strength and to show some courage, those words we used before. And in fact, like I'll put a link to this in the show notes, but I did a podcast, it was podcast number 24, so a few back, in which I sort of talked about and sort of reframed a Buddhist philosophy, or not a Buddhist philosophy, a Buddhist daily practice, which anyone can do. And, well, there's also a corresponding like exercise that you can do with it on a separate podcast, so you can check those out if you want. But number 6 that I was talking about in that is sort of positive attitude in the face of adversity. I think, going back to that example of the person who's like saying, I'm working too many hours, I want to see my family, I want to see my kids. The person saying man up. They may be saying man up as in like, come on, like it's not as bad as you think. See to how lucky you are, put on a brave face, find the goodness within that adversity. And, that is partly Buddhist philosophy, that is something that is, is a stem of Buddhist thinking. And, even stiff upper lip and stuff like that, I think it's got ties to, the writings of Man's Search for Meaning with Viktor Frankl, talking about, being in a hopeless situation and trying to find hope when there is no hope around, and find meaning when, you are being stripped of literally everything down to your clothes. I think there's some comparables between that and sort of stiff upper lip, like, especially coming from that sort of war mentality. It's like, things are horrendous right now, but try to find that stillness, try to find something else to like hold on to, try to find something that you can work with, And like, I get it. Like these are problematic phrases because, stiff upper lip means you haven't got any space to say, I'm scared or I'm frightened. It's like, I've just got to cope. I've just got to get by with this. But I think it's somewhere in there. Like it's trying to tell you to draw on some inner resource to help you cope with the difficulties at hand. If you can man up, if you can find something within you, like to attach to like help with this difficulty at hand, for example, being a man and the responsibilities of being a man, like this can help you drive forwards, And so, like, I think it's not, it's not quite right. It's not quite there. Like man up is carrying all the stuff I said before. It's carrying all that baggage with it, and it's just like it's really unhelpful. But I just think, like it's cultural. There's the sort of cultural lingo, isn't it? And people won't necessarily understand all of that baggage. For example, like when I was at school, like it was fine to say gay, like to go, fucking hell, that's so gay. And I'm someone who grew up, identifying, well, for about 15, 16, say bisexual. Now I would probably say pansexual. For those of you who don't know, like bisexual is like attraction to both the genders, like the two genders, so men and women, whereas pansexual sort of encompasses the whole gender spectrum within it. So just from my understanding of gender and the LGBTQ plus sort of community, that fits more with how I like to identify. I think for some people, like in general, it kind of means the same thing. It's just how far you are involved. Like if somebody said, oh, you knew me as bisexual, but now I'm saying I'm pansexual, and they tell you what pansexual means, I think people will say, well, I thought that's what you were. I thought that was just you liked everyone. So, in that sense, it's that. But, so even me with those kind of tendencies when I was younger and that kind of sexual identity, in a sense, like the word gay was used sort of derogatory, but it was like didn't understand the potential repercussions of what it was, even though in some small sense it would have been affecting me. So I think people using phrases like man up, they might not understand the inherent problems with that use of words, you know. So I think like, yeah, I think it's a problem and it's a bad phrase, and I think we should get away with it. But I think there's some good in it, and I think there's something that's trying to be communicated that's lost in all of that other baggage. So can we find a better term to dismantle the intended meaning from the problematic and destructive language? And, you know, it's complicated, but I think firstly, one thing I can say is some of it can be ignored and overcome. For example, if you're drinking the wrong drink, like if you're drinking a wine and somebody says, "Why don't you fucking man up and have a beer?" To me, that's sort of somebody communicating something to you that they're uncomfortable with about themselves. Like it affects them. You having a wine affects them because, you know, they feel like you should be having a beer, but it's all within them. It's their understanding of you, and it's what they're projecting onto you. So I think there's space for you to, like, for people to, in those examples, not take on board, you know, somebody else's hang-ups. And the more confident and self-assured you are in yourself, and the stronger sense of self you have within that, the more easy it will be to be resilient to taking on somebody else's baggage if they're saying you should have a beer, you shouldn't have a wine, man up. I think there's space for you to, you know, go like, that's them, that's not me. They're telling me what drink I should have. Well, I know why I'm having this drink. I have a strong sense of self and I like this drink. That's why I'm drinking this drink and not a beer. So if they're telling me they have a problem with what drink I'm drinking, I can see it clearly that the problem is within them and not within me. So I don't need to take on what they're telling me. So that's, I think, one aspect of man up that can be ignored and overcome. But the other aspect of it, I think the bit that is trying to communicate, like, find some resilience and find some strength within yourself. I was hoping by the end of this to kind of come up with a phrase. I couldn't think of one, but I think partly why I couldn't think of one is because we're sort of looking for quick fixes to our problems. You know, man up sort of means fixing the problems instantly. That you know, that example, I'm working too many hours, I want to see my family. Man up, it's like instant solve. It's like, just put up with it, problem solved. And I think really it's not just like dismissing the problem, it's like a complete denial of the problem. But, you know, our emotions are there to communicate to us that something's wrong, to listen to it. So like just saying man up, you're like denying the feeling, and you'll never, you know, you don't get the opportunity to learn and you don't get the opportunity to practice. And this is where it's important with men's mental health and phrasing it that way. Like, it's really important to let men know that it's okay to be vulnerable and to experience the full series of emotions, but also what to do with them and not just to be overwhelmed by them. Like, to know that you're not necessarily defined by your emotions. So I can't think of a phrase, but all I can think of is a phrase that was in that podcast. Like, if you want to listen to it, I think it's a good universal daily practice for everybody. But it's just, pain is the beginning of the journey toward growth. So if that person said to me, I think I'm working too many hours and I sort of miss my family, you know, pain is the beginning of the journey of growth. The fact that you're in some kind of discomfort right now maybe means something needs to change, whether it's physically, like practically, like changing the hours. Maybe it's something emotionally. Maybe it's something within the relationship. Something's not quite right. Something's out of balance. But the fact that you're feeling that pain is a recognition that, you know, pain is the beginning of the journey towards growth. Like, pain can be learnt from. To learn means there's space to grow. Sorry, no, pain carries a message. The message can be learnt from. To learn means there's space to grow. So pain is the beginning of the journey of growth. it's not as flashy, is it? It's not as like man up. The good thing about man up is it's 5 letters and 2 words. You're not going to find many other phrases that are so like man up. Like there's not really a way to encapsulate nuance and like pain is the beginning of the journey towards growth. Like it doesn't work the same way, does it? Anyway, this is something I would love to hear your thoughts about, because I imagine there's many people out there who would disagree with what I'm saying, or maybe would agree, or maybe has stuff to add. And I would genuinely really love to hear from you. So if there's a email address at savbaopod@gmail.com, and you can email me sort of extended thoughts. If they're just little thoughts you got to fire off, add me on Twitter. That's Savage Balance Podcast. No, sorry, it's SavBaoPod. Instagram is Sav... I've got confused. Twitter is SavBaoPod, and Instagram is Savage Balance Podcast. Maybe message me on there if you've got some thoughts about what I've just said. Oh, thanks very much for listening, guys. I enjoyed that one. That was a good bit of fun, and I hope, there's something in there for you. If you could tell people about this, if you could spread the word, that's the thing I'd really love people to do the most. So, if you like this or found some merit in it, just tell one other person. Just say, hey, I heard this thing, maybe check out 5 minutes of it, see what you think. I'd appreciate that. I'd appreciate it a lot. You could also subscribe, and you can rate and review on Apple Podcasts and all that stuff, or wherever, you listen to stuff. If you can subscribe in any way you can. Check out the back catalogue. There's other stuff in there, talking about toxic masculinity. The first episode was a piece I wrote about Trump. Just peruse through it, like the daily practices stuff. There's a few different things. That's some good stuff there. The artwork is by Dolly Gray. The music is by Danny Tonks. Thanks very much for listening, guys. I will be back next week with some exciting podcast stuff. It might be the stuff that I talked about in last week's episode. You'll know what it is if you listen to it there. Hey, it's coming up either next week or the week after. You never know. Hey, exciting times. That's the way that people tease things, isn't it? Like that's what movie trailers basically do, isn't it? They go like, oh, coming up in the Marvel universe, it's Iron Man 4. But you don't know what's going to happen, do you? Iron Man's coming. He's coming, but who's he going to be fighting? Is he going to be fighting the ice one or the fire one? Or is he going to be fighting the fists one? You don't know. You don't. I think that's how trailers work, so I'm stealing it. Nice one, guys. I will check you all out, but in a non-sexual way, next week. See you later.